Mark Lowry. I am the Assistant Director of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Office of Climate Change, and I am pleased to serve as the moderator of today's webinar on the New York State Extreme Heat Action Plan. Over the past 2 decades, New York State has taken important steps toward both reducing the emissions of greenhouse gas pollution that causes global warming and climate change, and adapting to the inevitable effects of climate change. June 28th marked an important milestone in the state's adaptation efforts with the release of the state's Extreme Heat Action Plan. As you will hear in more detail in the following presentations, consistent with an important recommendation in the Climate Action Council Scoping Plan for implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, Governor Kathy Hochul directed DEC and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, more commonly known as NYSERDA, to develop a plan for reducing risk associated with extreme heat back in 2022. Acting on the governor's direction, DEC and NYSERDA convened state agencies and authorities to form the Extreme Heat Action Plan Work Group, and over the past 2 years have coordinated the work of dozens of staff across these many agencies to develop the plan that was released in June. Now, as you might imagine, producing such a plan entails an immense amount of discussion, coordination, and review through all the agencies involved. And although numerous staff contributed to the overall effort, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize my colleagues who provided the leadership that was necessary to bring this work to its fruition. Dr. Leo Bockinger of DEC and NYSERDA's Erica Joswick, Jenny Singbach, and Amanda Stevens. Next slide, please. As it happens, we could not have selected a more appropriate day for this webinar, as much of the eastern United States, including New York State, is under a moderate or even major heat risk, according to the National Weather Service. We can confidently project that events such as the one we are experiencing today will only become more frequent, severe, and longer as the climate continues to warm. We will begin this webinar with an overview of extreme heat in New York State, followed by a more detailed presentation on the plan itself, before a series of very quick presentations on available resources. Next slide, please. In the first segment of this webinar, we will hear about key heat health impacts and how extreme heat will intensify due to climate change before digging into the Extreme Heat Action Plan itself. Additional information on extreme heat and health is available in a companion report, Extreme Heat in New York State, which was released concurrently with the Extreme Heat Action Plan and is available online. And I believe the URL to that plan will be, or to that report will be placed in the chat. We will take questions after all the presentations have concluded, as Craig said, but you may enter your questions in the chat window whenever you like throughout the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and posted along with the slides used today at DEC's Extreme Heat webpage. During this upcoming segment, we will hear from 4 speakers whom I will introduce now. Dr. Neil Muscatello will begin with an overview of heat effects on human health. Neil is director of the Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Epidemiology at the New York State Department of Health. Neil will be followed by Amanda Stevens. Amanda will discuss the relationship between extreme heat events and climate change. She is a senior project manager with NYSERDA's Environmental Research Program and oversaw the development and release of NYSERDA's New York State Climate Change Impact Assessment. Information on the Extreme Heat Action Plan itself will be provided by Dr. Leo Bockinger and Erica Joswick. Leo is a program manager here at DEC's Office of Climate Change, and Erica is the resilience lead for NYSERDA. With that, I will turn things over to Neil Muscatello. Neil?
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be here talking with you today. Next slide, please. So this first slide just provides an overview of the impact of climate change on human health. And I think what I wanted to point out here is that although with this Extreme Heat Action Plan, we're focusing a lot on that upper left-hand corner piece of the pie as we see temperatures, warm across the state. We should also note that heat is going to influence many of these other pieces of the pie too. We know that heat interacts to change levels of pollutants in the air, extends the seasons when pollen's in the air, things like that. So I think that's one thing that I wanted to mention here is that, you know, while extreme heat and the direct impacts of heat are obviously key and forefront to this plan, I think many of the other actions agencies have been talking about taking through this work have also, we hope to have influence some of these other pieces of the pie as well. Next slide, please. So I probably don't need to tell most of you on this call, but when we see warmer temperatures, when we experience warmer temperatures, we see an increase in people going to the emergency department and hospital for heat-related illness, and that's what is illustrated in these slides, both pulling from some warm weather we had in September 2023 and our recent extreme heat events in just this past June of 2024. The lines in each of the charts, the solid lines show the temperatures or heat index values for those on each of the days that are shown in the chart, and then the bars are the number of emergency visits we saw for heat-related illness. So you can see a clear pattern with, you know, extreme temperatures and an increase in heat-related ED visits. Next slide. But beyond that, what research, you know, around this country, around the world, and in New York State as well has shown is that heat also impacts other health outcomes as well. These slides are pulled from some work that was done and published several years ago by researchers here at the State Department of Health. This work eventually led to a revision in the thresholds at which the National Weather Service issues heat warnings in New York State. But the message here is that in addition to increasing risks of heat stress, those direct related heat impacts, which you can see in the upper left-hand panel on this slide, and which I illustrated in the previous slide, we also see increased risks for things like dehydration, which is a subset of heat-related illness, but as well as acute kidney failure and cardiovascular disease. Next slide. You know, one of the things that surprised us a little bit, but which has been increasingly shown in other studies that have been done as well, is that these risks, you know, can be observed both in urban and rural parts of the state. We know that in urban areas, we have the urban heat island effect, which can magnify exposure to extreme heat. But we think there's other, you know, in rural areas, there may be things like access to care and different types of work, jobs that, you know, that people in rural areas have that make them at risk for heat-related illnesses as well. So, you know, I think thinking about this as a statewide plan, I think it's important to note that not only this is not just an urban issue, but a rural issue as well. And as we think about this too, the one other thing I wanted to mention is that we've tried to keep in mind in developing the Extreme Heat Action Plan, particularly the impacts on vulnerable populations. So this could be people who don't have access to a spot to cool off, which is a key factor for reducing the risks from heat. It could be people who, you know, that could be people whose jobs take them outdoors, and so they're outside in the hot weather more frequently. It could be people who don't have an air conditioner or can't run an air conditioner because the costs associated with that. That could be contributing. It could be things associated with age, which may bring physiological changes that make people more at risk for heat. So, you know, people who are taking different medications or using certain drugs that may put them more at risk. So I think as we talk about what's in the Extreme Heat Action Plan, you'll hear more about that. So that was my 5-minute timer, and I'm going to pass it to Amanda now. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Neil. Next slide, please. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about climate change and these extreme heat events that we've been having now, and we'll have more in the future. So what this slide is showing right now is just that really the point is that all regions of the state are going to be seeing an increase in these heat events, whether it's a number of days that are over 90 degrees, whether it's how often we see a heat wave. They're really going to happen all over the state. And I think one of the key things to recognize here is that even areas that don't currently experience a lot of extreme heat, like North Country, Lake Placid area, you can see that on here, they're going to be seeing a lot more too and may not be prepared for it. So you can see even, like I said, Lake Placid, Dannemora way up in the north, by end of the century, we're seeing, between 20 and 30 days over 90, whereas now they rarely see those days. So this isn't relegated to certain parts of the state or to cities. It's really across the state that we're going to be seeing these issues. Next slide. Just another look at this. This is an example. This is kind of a complicated graph, so I just pulled out one region of the state here, but this is similar across the state. Again, that the maximum heat index that a region or an area will see is also going to be increasing. And we've seen, just in the past month, as Neil showed in one of his slides, that we've been seeing already some of these really high heat indexes. And as we go throughout the century, those maximum heat indices are going to be increasing, really getting into dangerous levels across the state. Next slide. And this is a lot, so I'm not going to dwell on it here, but I just wanted to highlight a few things here. And really the point is that not only does extreme heat hit health, but it really impacts a lot of different sectors across the state, infrastructure, all areas of the state from urban to rural. So as Neil mentioned, there are certainly very vulnerable groups that are particularly susceptible to extreme heat, whether it's children, the elderly, those who work outside, low-income communities. But it also affects infrastructure, energy, electricity, also the demand for those services. The rural areas, again, as Neil mentioned, there are fewer facilities and smaller facilities in some of these medical facilities in some of these rural areas, so they can get overwhelmed. And a lot of the rural jobs are outdoors, so a lot of folks are going to be exposed. And then in the agriculture industry, it's not only the workers themselves who will be exposed, but things like the dairy industry are very susceptible to extreme heat as well and could see drops in production. And then urban areas, we have the urban heat island effect. We also have poor air quality coming from stagnant air and heat as well. So there's a lot of different sectors and areas of the state that extreme heat impacts. So it's not just one thing. It's a pretty broad swath of impacts. I think I'm just going to stop there for the moment, and I will pass it back to Leo to get us moving.
Thank you, Amanda. Next slide, please. We heard, now my computer froze. We heard about the impacts of extreme heat, and we heard about how climate change has the potential to drive heat exposure, extreme heat, its impacts now and in the future. To address those impacts, we need local, regional, state action, community action to work hand in hand in building capacity, strengthening resilience, and advancing adaptation. The Heat Action Plan, the Extreme Heat Action Plan, which we're presenting here today, has the goal to formulate specific state actions to help communities identify, prepare for, and address the impacts of extreme heat in a changing climate. Erica Joswick will highlight some of those actions in the plan in just a moment. But first, I want to take a brief moment to go over how we developed this plan, the importance of community input in formulating action, and overview how this plan itself is structured when you explore it on your own time. Next slide, please. As Mark Lowry already mentioned, this plan was developed pursuant to a 2022 State of the State Directive by Governor Hochul. For DEC and NYSERDA to develop this plan to address current and future impacts of extreme heat on disadvantaged communities, areas of employment, and recreational zones across the state. Next slide, please. To do this, DEC and NYSERDA partnered with 28 state agencies who contributed their expertise, their leadership, and their hard work in to an interagency work group, the Extreme Heat Action Plan work group. But importantly, as I mentioned, for any action-oriented plan to advance actions that are meaningful in addressing impacts on communities on the front lines to extreme heat exposure, we sought to engage early on and throughout the plan development with impacted communities, experts, stakeholders, local government officials to understand their needs and impacts and formulate this plan. Next slide, please. Over the last 2 years, the DEC, NYSERDA, and the Extreme Heat Action Plan Work Group developed 3 key outputs in addition to advancing actions throughout the 2 years. In July 2022, we released an interim recommendations report that includes a high-level overview of impacts and needs gathered together with initial stakeholder input, and importantly, outlined a set of immediate actions the state could pursue with existing resources and capacities. In June 2023, the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, short DISHES, released a heat-specific annex to the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, which formulates how existing resources can be mobilized in the case of a declared extreme heat emergency that requires state response. And our wonderful colleague Pete Ciccetti, who will speak to you later, can explain this much better than I can. And finally, we are really excited today to present the Extreme Heat Action Plan itself, which stands complementary to these ongoing efforts and initiatives to advance climate change adaptation, extreme heat adaptation activities, and build long-term community preparedness. Next slide, please. This plan, and you will find a link to it in the chat, puts adaptation into action. It formulates mission, goal, and principles for extreme heat adaptation to inform state action and defines 49 strategies in 4 action areas to advance community adaptation and state activities to support communities. For each of those actions, the plan identified short and mid-range goals and concludes with separate sections on how this plan will be implemented and evaluated. In addition, as already mentioned, and you will already find that link in the chat, we also released a summary report entitled Extreme Heat in New York State. This report summarizes impacts and vulnerabilities and points to existing tools by which you can identify vulnerable and exposed communities. This companion report is aimed at supporting and guiding state as well as communities in taking actions to address extreme heat. Next slide, please. Put together, the plan aims at equitably reducing the impacts of extreme heat, especially by helping local communities adapt to extreme heat and support local local capacities for adaptation. And when you open up the plan and explore it on your own time after this webinar today, I want to just give you a brief overview of how it is organized to make it easier for you to explore this plan. Early on in the plan, you find a list of all the actions that are included in the plan. This is in section 2, EHAP actions at a glance. You see the table of contents on the right, starting at page 12. Much deeper descriptions of those actions, including the goals, the lead and implementing agencies, you will find, and detailed descriptions of the actions themselves, you will find starting at page 33 in the section 7, extreme heat adaptation actions. In addition to those core elements of the plan, we describe missions, goals, and principles, which are cross-cutting across the actions and activities and are meant to form and guide state adaptation. We describe how this plan was developed, and we also give a high-level overview of existing extreme heat response, which this adaptation plan complements. We also have a section that describes how we implement and evaluate the plan. Next slide, please. How did this plan come together? As mentioned, we sought to engage early on and throughout the development process with impacted communities, local stakeholders, community partners, as well as the various experts from academia and across state agencies. Use different forms of engagement to do so in broad ways. Starting in November 2022 and until last summer, we convened monthly collaborative planning forums. Sometimes usually monthly, sometimes twice a month, state staff convened together with experts, representatives of community-based organizations, and members of local governments to explore goals for this plan, assess impacts and vulnerabilities, identify needs, and develop and think through different kinds of strategies for extreme heat adaptation. Next slide, please. Following these comprehensive planning, collaborative planning forums over the course of last summer, we hosted 7 in-person workshops across New York State to better understand locally specific impacts, needs, work ongoing in communities, and how different strategies might fit into different contexts. At the same time, the state started working with the different agencies to start developing a first draft of this plan. Next slide, please. This culminated over the course of last year into a first draft, which we are very grateful for the members of a community advisory panel and a scientific advisory panel to provide deep review and in-depth feedback on. The members of the community advisory panel and scientific advisory panel were able to review earlier this year and really contributed foundationally and fundamentally to the final product that we are proud to share today. And so I again want to express my gratitude for the members. You can find the member organizations of both panels in the appendix of the plan as well. Next slide, please. So this process and this work culminated in the mentioned 49 actions across 4 action tracks. And it's my joy to hand now over to Erika Czoswiak to give you some highlights of what those actions are. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leo. And really nice to be on the call today talking with so many of you about the work that's been done and that many of you contributed to over the last several years. So as Leo said, the plan is organized into 4 different action tracks with 49 actions each. And each action has the same structure across. You'll be able to see which agency is tagged as the responsible lead agency and which agencies are going to support the implementation of the action, the short and mid-range goals, a description of the action, and as well as a list of the existing programs and resources that are either going to support the implementation or will be built upon in order to complete the action. In addition to the goals and principles that Leo mentioned of the overall plan, all of the action tracks also include a set of findings that can help ensure the actions in each track address the current and historical inequities, and empower vulnerable community members and disadvantaged communities across all of the actions. That was a core tenet of the plan, and it was one that the EHAP working group team worked to ensure was incorporated into each action. So today you can see that each of these action tracks has several sub-themes. I'm going to pull out a couple of example actions from each of these tracks to give a flavor of what's in each of these categories. But obviously, much more detail on each of the tracks can be found at the Extreme Heat Action Plan itself on DEC's website. So if you want to go to the next slide here, the first highlighted action is in the first action track on adaptation planning and implementation. T105, deepen climate resilience and extreme heat adaptation collaboration with frontline CBOs, prioritizing schools, youth leaders, and youth organizations. This is an action led by DEC that will seek to engage with organizations that support young people in engaging on climate change, especially those in frontline communities and heat vulnerable communities. Through this action, DEC would engage with those frontline community-based organizations, youth climate organizations, and other state and local partners so that they can better understand what the needs are as they relate to extreme heat, and eventually work towards supporting a statewide convening of youth climate leaders to make sure that there's that link between these groups and informing state and local climate action. On the next slide, we go to the second kind of category in Action Track 1 on promoting research, development, and innovation. And so a good example of this is in T107, evaluating the existing heat vulnerability index, the HVI, and exploring opportunities to use HVI factors to improve program and resource targeting. In this action, led by Department of Health, they intend to update the existing heat vulnerability index to make sure that they have the most accurate data sets and include other categories of vulnerability, including disadvantaged communities, social vulnerability, temperature, heat mortality, and morbidity factors. Developing these strong indicators would then allow more refined targeting of different programs based on intervention goals and focusing outreach for other programs that agencies support, such as those run by DEC, NYSERDA, and OTDA, so that they are enhancing the correct campaigns, really targeting resources where it's needed, and also providing this tool of the updated heat vulnerability index for local planners as well. In the next slide, we go over to Action Track 2, focusing on preparedness, communication, and workers' safety. The first focuses on this pre-event communication, and in T203, we see an initiative to expand access to safe swimming and address equity gaps with recreational opportunities for communities facing extreme heat. This, led by the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, builds on a component that was actually highlighted in the 2024 State of the State to launch the New York Swims program and provide funding for facilitating the renovation and construction of pools in high-need neighborhoods across the state, as well as providing connection for kids to get to those cool spaces and including additional grants and addressing support to the lifeguard shortage as well. The next category on the next slide speaks to the workers' health and safety component. And in T210, we have an initiative to protect workers' heat health through engagement with local partners, focused on outreach activities, leveraging existing touch points to provide services and protections, and disseminating additional information on Know Your Rights. This is a particularly dense action by Department of Labor, supported by Department of Health, and has a bunch of different facets to make sure that our most vulnerable workers understand what their rights are they have in existing protections, and are working with the partners in order to get that information into those who need it most. Through this action, Department of Labor would collaborate with community partners and those trusted communicators to identify targeted outreach opportunities to workers who are most vulnerable to extreme heat. And this can apply to numerous groups, such as temporary and part-time workers who maybe don't have a stable position in the workplace, placement agency workers, day laborers, and young unskilled workers who do not yet have the knowledge or conditioning for outdoor work. This also would involve making sure that this outreach is in the language that is best understood, including variety of languages and visual materials. In the next action track on the next slide, we move into the built environment, infrastructure, and managed spaces. In the first category of supporting resilient built environments, it speaks to the different timescales that is needed to move the needle on extreme heat preparedness and mitigation. And so in T301, we have commitments to expand immediate access to affordable cooling through additional funding for cooling equipment, expanded reimbursement under medical insurance, and continued advocacy for additional federal HEAP funding. This action, led by the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance, is a multi-pronged activity here where we have some immediate actions that are available now. In summer of 2024, OTDA and NYSERDA have coordinated to further bolster the HEAP cooling assistance component by reallocating $7 million of LIHEAP funding to better support the HEAP cooling assistance this summer. So that is available now, and of course we encourage folks to apply as soon as possible if they're interested in taking advantage of the HEAP allocation this summer. In addition, Department of Health is going to continue to work with OTDA to promote the cooling benefit so that this information reaches those who need it most. And looking a little bit longer term, as announced in the State of the State this past year, Department of Health also aims to add coverage for the purchase, delivery, and installation of air conditioners in the New York State Essential Plan for those members that have persistent asthma and therefore give better access to this life-saving equipment. In the next slide here, we are looking more in the adaptation in built environment spaces. And T312, fund facility improvements, thermal resilience, and decarbonization at educational institutions. This action, led by NYSERDA, could identify and make the funds available, focusing on under-resourced public schools that lack adequate cooling and need more thermal resilience capacity. This initiative will fund building facility upgrades for weatherization, cooling, and heat resilience, including clean heating and cooling technologies. And these can target specifically under-resourced schools and those located in urban heat islands. And then finally, to wrap up Action Track 3, looking at the next slide, at the example on developing resilient and equitable infrastructure of T320, accelerate the transition of internal combustion bus and agency fleets to electric propulsion to reduce heat and ozone exposure along bus routes. This action is led by MTA, but is supported by a coalition of many different transit and transportation partners, where they're building upon existing commitments on transitioning bus fleets across New York State, switching from internal combustion engines to electric motors. And this not only supports the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, but also reduces extreme heat and air pollution exposure, especially in heat vulnerable communities. This is also encouraging public transit providers to accelerate the electrification of these fleets, especially in heat vulnerable disadvantaged communities. And then finally, our last action track on ecosystem-based adaptation includes a wide variety of actions on the next slide that focus on ecosystem-based adaptation and using nature-based systems, recreating those practices. And our example action here we have is on T406, this action that fund and train arborists, forests, youth conservation corps, and other conservation staff to plan, install, maintain green infrastructure and ecosystem-based adaptation projects to reduce extreme heat impacts. So long title there, but a lot of great stuff in it. This action will support urban forestry programs with tree planting and maintenance, monitoring of existing mature trees to reduce community canopy heat loss that supports reduction of the urban heat island effect. This involves developing high-quality training programs for future foresters and creates specific opportunities to recruit youth from disadvantaged communities, justice-involved individuals, and individuals from other underrepresented groups for training and apprenticeship programs, and making sure that they have the ability to take advantage of some of these new opportunities coming online. So certainly a lot that we could get into across the 49 actions, but hoping that some of these examples gave a little bit of an indication of the type and breadth of work that's included in each of these action tracks. And going to the next slide here, want to give a little bit more detail on how implementation will work. You know, we've done the plan, we've talked a lot to many people over the last several years, and now it's really time to put it into action. DEC and NYSERDA are committed to implementing this plan and supporting agencies in that implementation. And through the existing structure of the Extreme Heat Action Plan Working Group, we'll continue to work with those lead and support agencies to implement the actions. This will also be monitored and evaluated to ensure that the short-term and midterm goals are being met or advanced upon after the implementation of this plan or as we go into implementation now. And we also want to show our progress along the way in a pre-summer readiness resource. So on a yearly basis, we'll be updating the pre-summer readiness on the DEC Extreme Heat Action Plan website, making sure that we're showing the progress thus far on some of the commitments in this plan, as well as updates and compilation of resources prior to the heat season that can be available to local partners as well as they look to mitigate the impacts of extreme heat in their communities. On to the next slide here. We are really indebted to the work that many have and the time that many have given us to develop the plan so far. And we want to hear your feedback on how it goes and how it's being felt impact-wise in your communities. The Extreme Heat Action Plan was envisioned as a living document and one that will be continually updated to guide the ongoing Extreme Heat Action Plan efforts. DEC and NYSERDA are committed to taking ongoing public input to inform the implementation and future updates to this plan. And if you see the QR code to the right here, want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to send us some feedback on the plan itself, on implementation measures, and on those pre-summer readiness resources as they become available. We definitely are committed to taking this feedback, and we are very grateful for the time that's been spent already and that we hope will be spent in the future to respond effectively to the current and future impacts of extreme heat as we work on this challenge together. So thanks so much, everyone, for the time again in spending with us on this webinar today. Certainly looking forward to questions and comments here, and I'll turn it back to Mark to take us into the next section and share some existing resources that are available now.
Thank you, Neil, Amanda, Leo, and Erica. Our next segment will consist, I think we need the next slide, I'm sorry. Our next segment will consist of a series of lightning talks to highlight resources for communities to use in taking action to address heat risk. By necessity of time, these talks will not be comprehensive, but the slides, as we said before, will be posted along with recording of this webinar. And those slides include additional resources. Our first lightning speaker will be Pete Cicchetti, who is Executive Deputy Director of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services Office of Emergency Management. Pete will be followed in quick succession by three speakers you've already met, Neil Muscatello, Leo Bockinger, and Erica Joswick. So with that, Pete.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. I am, as Mark said, from State Office of Emergency Management, and I'm going to briefly talk about our state OEM programs related to planning and training, how we track incidents and events, how we respond to events, and then at the end, wrap it up in the context of extreme heat, what we do to coordinate the state's response to extreme heat incidents, as well as the extreme heat annex that we developed as part of the EHAP process. If you could go to the next slide, please, and then one after that. Thank you very much. So at State OEM, we are responsible for the state's planning and preparedness efforts for natural and human-caused disasters. This includes the development of the state's emergency response plans. In the broadest sense, that plan or that framework is called our Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, or State SEMP. And then in a more granular sense, we develop what are called annexes to that plan that are structured either by function, for example, mass care, or that are hazard specific, for example, extreme heat. We have a state comprehensive emergency management plan and about 30 annexes to that plan, all of which are available online for anyone's perusal to see how we structure ourselves, but also to learn if you're looking to develop a plan similar to learn how to potentially develop it. We also support counties and localities in their planning efforts. We support every single county in developing their own SEMP and developing their annexes as appropriate. We train on these plans at both the state and the county and local level, and we exercise those plans at both the state and the county level. Just earlier today, just before this, we had a radiological emergency preparedness drill with both the counties of Monroe and Wayne, as well as ourselves, to practice our plans related to Ginna nuclear power plant if something were to occur there. And that just wrapped up right before this call. So we are very used to working with counties about exercising plans across a range of incidents. We also track events in real time via the State Watch Center, which is a 24/7, 365 entity that I'll talk about on the next slide. And we coordinate the state's response to events if they rise to the level of needing a coordinated state response via the state's Emergency Operations Center, which I'll talk about in 2 slides. Next slide, please. So the State Watch Center is a 24/7, 365 communication center. Think of it as an information hub. The State Watch Center receives information in through a wide range of sources, whether it be scanner traffic or radio traffic. It could be through social media. It could be from, it most often is from state agency personnel who are embedded out in regions. Every state agency has thresholds for when they need to report things into the Watch Center. So they receive information from a wide range of resources. They compile and aggregate that information, and they disseminate it back out to relevant personnel at both the state and county level and to decision makers as well, to ensure situational awareness across the board and ensure that everyone has real-time information that has been vetted and is consistent. The State Watch Center is also our primary communicator with the National Weather Service. Every piece of weather information that the National Weather Service puts out from any of the weather forecast offices in the state of New York goes to our Watch Center, and then our watch sends it out, whether it be a watch, a warning, a briefing, some kind of information from the meteorologist that they want to tell us. It could be anything. The Watch Center is our primary communicator with them. Next slide, please. Our State Emergency Operations Center is the structure we use to respond to incidents. We will activate this if and when we need to coordinate a multi-agency state response to an incident. We did activate the state EOC just a few weeks ago when we had the several-day heat wave across the state with heat indexes that were pretty significant, and we had a heat risk that was extreme in a number of areas. We will activate the Emergency Operations Center and bring other state agencies in as appropriate by function as needed. So the way an activation looks will really vary by incident, but it is our hub for information gathering, reporting, and resource coordination when we need to do a coordinated state response that is sort of above the level of what the everyday State Watch Center can handle. Next slide, please. As it relates to extreme heat, we do a lot with other state agencies to coordinate information sharing related to extreme heat, resource coordination related to extreme heat, messaging related to extreme heat, etc. So some of the examples are coordinating very proactively with DOH on the Cooling Center Finder website to make sure the information is updated regularly and routinely, and we will work with counties on making sure that they're getting the information to DOH. Coordinating with the Department of Public Service on anticipated power load during an extreme heat event to make sure we're not concerned about brownouts and blackouts, and if we are, to coordinate potential voluntary or even mandatory reductions. We coordinate with the governor's office very closely on messaging, communicating out, and also coordinating the potential need for a state emergency order. We coordinate with counties and localities on preparedness activities if they need anything like bottled or canned water or water tankers for their efforts, and where they're opening cooling centers, if they're considering overnight cooling shelters, and if we need to get Red Cross involved, etc. And final slide, please. As Leo mentioned earlier, as part of this EHAP process, we developed an extreme heat specific annex to the state SEMP. And as he said, it outlines how we coordinate our government resources to respond to an extreme heat incident. It is one of more than 30 of its kind As I said, we have hazard-specific annexes as well as functional annexes. This plan was published last June and gets updated annually, as they all do. It is available on our website. The most recent update was March 2024, so it is very current. It is available with all of our other annexes on our website for anyone to look through. It is every annex we develop is a multi-agency coordinated effort that involves input from across state government to ensure we are accurately depicting what we have to prepare for, respond to, and recover from specific incidents. And with that, I will turn it back to Neil for the next section.
Next slide. All right, so in just a few minutes here, I was asked to provide a short overview of resources DOH has that you may find helpful in some of the work you're doing around extreme heat planning and response. So again, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I encourage you to take a look at the links that are provided on this slide, as they'll take you to pages where you can find a whole lot more information about extreme heat and other impacts of climate and weather on health. Actually, if you just go to health.ny.gov right now, our extreme heat advice is sort of forward placed on the main DOH page, given the hot weather we've been having. But you'll also find guidance here specific to certain groups who may be vulnerable. And we're always happy to answer any questions you have on that, or if you see a gap in the information that you're looking for, feel free to reach out to me. Leo knows how to get in touch with me. Next slide, please. Again, this was a little bit more specifics on our extreme heat page. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but if you go again to health.ny.gov, our extreme heat webpage is forward placed on the main DOH webpage. Otherwise, you can navigate to the link shown here, but you'll see all different kinds of resources designed to provide information and awareness, increase awareness about heat health risks. Next slide, please. So one tool I did want to mention is CDC's health risk tool. So this is was just rolled out to the eastern U.S. this year after being available for the western United States for a number of years. So it's still sort of experimental, but the heat risk tool is really was designed based on a consideration of both health and heat information. And what this tool allows you to do is enter your zip code, and you can find a heat forecast for your zip code of residence or wherever you're looking, along with actions you can take to protect your health. And there's some nice guidance for healthcare professionals as well. So if you're looking for sort of up-to-date information on how the weather outside could be impacting your health, take a look at this tool. Next slide, please. So Erica, or Pete, excuse me, mentioned earlier our cooling center finder. We work closely with DISHES to make this information available each year, working in partnership with our local emergency managers and local health departments. This tool is designed to provide information about cooling center locations around the state for counties who have reported that information. I've said this before. If you've heard me speak, we think of cooling centers as one tool in our toolkit for responding to extreme heat. Ideally, we want people to be able to be cool in their home. For those who don't have access and for whom we can't get access when there is an extreme heat event, cooling centers provide a place where people can get cool. I didn't provide a link here, but if you go to the DOH website and enter Cooling Center Finder, you should be able to locate that. Next slide, please. The last tool that I wanted to mention is the state's heat vulnerability index, and this is what Erica had mentioned when she was talking, that we're going to be working on updating as part of our extreme heat action planning work. So this tool is designed to identify census tracts with larger proportions of people with characteristics that may make them vulnerable to heat. So it's intended to be helpful in discussions about where to focus extreme heat adaptations or communications to help think about where during an event you may have people who are more at risk. But it's certainly designed to be used in combination with local knowledge. And I also wanted to point out New York City has their own heat vulnerability index, which I've provided a link to at the bottom of this page. Next slide, please. On the heat vulnerability index page, you can find information about how the HVI was created, the specific components that make up the HVI, and then you can also actually download data and documentation for your own use. Next slide. So now I'll hand it over to Leo.
Thank you, Neil. I will just briefly overview some programs, specifically grant and assistance programs at DEC that can support a variety of the different kinds of actions that can address extreme heat, especially on the extreme heat adaptation side. The first one that I want to highlight is the Climate Smart Communities program, which is a local government grant program that supports local municipalities to take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as adapt to climate change. The program offers grants, rebates for electric vehicle and free technical assistance, and especially the Climate Smart Community Coordinators are available on a regional scale to support and provide free technical assistance for communities. You can find more information on climatesmartny.gov. You will also have, once you have the slides posted online, the titles are hyperlinked to all those resources. On the website, you find more information about the grant program, how to connect, how to find your Climate Smart Community Coordinators, but also explore the different kinds of actions that are part of this program where extreme heat already plays a role in as well. In addition, there are a variety of environmental justice grants offered through the DEC Office of Environmental Justice to support and empower local communities to advance solutions in their communities, including to extreme heat. One such example is the Community Impacts Grant that is offered through the Office of Environmental Justice and provides state assistance funding through the Environmental Justice Community Impacts program to advance projects such as research, community gardens, tree plantings, education and curricular development, urban farming training, habitat restoration, water quality monitoring, air quality monitoring, and many more. And a lot of those activities work on the intersection with extreme heat, vulnerability, and other environmental and social burdens faced by environmental justice communities. And finally, the Urban and Community Forestry Grant, as just one additional example here, supports a wide range of urban and community forestry activities, not only for planting, but also for planning and maintenance, and support this also with technical assistance functions. So I wanted to keep this short and crisp here. The links are in the slides, and more information on the various things you've seen in the chat. With that, I'm handing it over to Erika.
Thanks. So on the next slide here, I'll also be keeping it short and highlighting some ongoing NYSERDA programs that are open now and available for folks to take advantage of at different scales. So you can see a pretty large list here. Many of these programs also have the dual benefit of and the primary purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But what they also do is to potentially add a clean heating and cooling solution to areas that maybe are currently provided by fossil fuels, and therefore having multiple co-benefits here. One particular resource that I want to make sure that this group is aware of is the Natural Carbon Solutions Challenge that's open now. So round one recently selected its initial winners for the first round of funding, but there's a $13 million allocation open currently until August 20th for projects that can mitigate the impacts of extreme heat and reduce building emissions. There's an informational webinar that's on NYSERDA's website that will be hosted on the 23rd of July. So if you're interested in more information about that opportunity, we encourage you to tune into that upcoming webinar as well. So then I will pass it on to our next presenter, which I unfortunately forget who's next, but thank you for your time on the NYSERDA slide.
I think it goes back to Leo.
It does. It's a fourth and back. Next slide, please. Oh, we are on the slide. Please stay on the slide. I will not go into detail on all those resources. Again, we mentioned a couple of times that the slides will be posted. The titles here again are hyperlinked, but this is really to show that while we gave some highlighted programs, provided some highlights to some of the programs and resources that are available already, there are many more. You find many more here on this slide. There's additional information online. I also want to point to, for funding more broadly to support resilience and adaptation work, to a new funding finder, which link I will post in the chat momentarily, which includes funding and other resources that are available, including for Bond Act resources. With that, I will hand it back to Mark to close us out and open it up for questions.